want to ask you about this agreement, this loan agreement you signed with the IMF earlier in 2019. Your country has always been considered stable economically compared to others in the region. You see what other countries are going through, like Argentina. Venezuela might not be a fair comparison, but what was behind the move to take on that loan?
So first, the stability in Ecuador, it's directly related to the dollar as the national currency. That's the only, how can I say, that's the only policy that has been stable in Ecuador for the last 20 years. The first 2 years of dollarization were a bit drastic. There was, like an adjustment that was tough for the people, but after that, we enjoyed, specifically from 2002 to 2007, we enjoyed steady economic growth, a reduction on poverty, and other important achievements through that decision of taking the dollar as a national currency. That had some sacrifices, like losing the monetary sovereignty, but I think in the end, when you add up, it has been more positive than anything for Ecuador. Since we are dollarized, you cannot have permanent fiscal deficits because you have to get the dollars from somewhere. And what happened in the last government that lasted for 10 years, they took those dollars from debt, right? And that debt is what we have to pay today. Since it is not possible to keep growing that debt because there would be no cash flow to pay for it, we had to make adjustments, and we had to look for support from financial institutions that were willing to loan us that money, and we achieved an agreement not only with the IMF, but with different multilateral financial institutions, like the World Bank or the CAF, which is the Andean, la Corporation for Development. And that's where we got this package of 10.2 billion, for doing this new economic process in Ecuador. This package meant that we changed expensive debt that was the only debt that we were being able to get for a more reasonable debt. 30 years term, 4% interest rate. That's what we needed. But to sustain that, we need to do what is necessary, and that is achieving an equilibrium on the budget.
Ecuador has had a fiscal deficit since 2007. During the golden years of high oil prices from 2010 to 2014, the country chose to invest in schools, hospitals, and infrastructure instead of saving the surplus or balancing the budget. Now the weight of the deficit and the debt seems too heavy.
No country can carry that burden for this long. It's 12 years of fiscal deficit and a debt that is around 65% of the GDP today, and it's not, most of the debt is not in the best terms, so to say. If it was a debt with longer periods, with lower interest rates, it could be manageable, but as it is presented, it means that every year from now, it started this year specifically, between capital and interest, we have to serve 7% of the GDP on debt. On a budget of 28 billion, we have to pay 7.3 billion on debt every year. So that's unbearable. And there is only two ways to achieve equilibrium on a budget, and that is increasing income or lowering expenses. So we have done a lot on lowering expenses. We reduced the GDP that President Moreno inherited from last government from 7% to 3%. That has had an impact on the economy. The economy slowed down a bit. We are still growing, but very slowly, which is not enough. You cannot forget that we are receiving 500,000 migrants from Venezuela as of today. That has also a big cost, a social cost and an economic cost. We're doing it. We're doing it because we understand that the situation is critical for them, and it could be any of us. This is solidarity at its best, from Ecuadorians to Venezuelans, from Colombians to Venezuelans.
You mentioned that some of this stretches back to the previous administration. So how much of it is from the past, and how much of what we're seeing is due to global and economic conditions?
Well, the size of the debt is mostly from the past, mostly. It has grown very little in the last 2 years because President Moreno took the decisions to reduce the deficit by decreasing expenses, by lowering expenses.
In January 2000, Ecuador adopted the US dollar as its own currency. That means the country cannot print its own money and consequently is not able to devalue the currency. Dollars come into the country via debt, tourism, investment, remittances, and of course, exports. So that's why foreign trade is key to sustain the economy.
There is not much we can do without markets. And Ecuador is a small economy, it's a small market. If we produce and we don't have no one to sell to, there's not much we can do. We have a trade agreement with the European Union that is working well. We have good economic relations with the US, with China, but with both countries, we need a more steady, a more sustainable trade relation, right? And I think that's something we have to work on. That's the reason why I'm in the US right now. I think it's important not only to get investment from US companies to Ecuador, but also to have a clear route of commerce, of trade between both countries. The same with China. I speak frequently with the Chinese ambassador. Ecuador's commerce with China has grown in an important manner, but still, there is a lot of gray areas there that we think should be clear.
The United States is Ecuador's main trade market. China ranks number 6, but the government is working on selling and buying more from China.
The negotiations with Colombia, Peru, and Chile are a bit easier. There are more differences with Mexico, but I think we can work them over. I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with Mexican representatives, and I think it will be possible. In any agreement, I believe the word free on the trade agreements, it's not exactly like that. If it was free, there was nothing to talk about. If it was free, let's just open our doors and do it. No. It's called like that, we know them, those instruments like that, but actually there is a lot to agree on, right? So these are trade agreements. We have to achieve consensus on many items for our trade relations, and that's what we're working on with Mexico, with the US, with China also.
Meanwhile, the goal is to balance the economy. The government fears that if they don't act quickly, the country may have to drop its dollarization.
This has to be done for the greater good. The only way out, if we don't do anything today, would be losing de-dollarization, which is the only popular economic policy that we have in Ecuador. Everyone would do what we have to do to be able to sustain that economic policy. If we don't act now, if we keep growing our debt, and then we will not find financing in the near future, in 2 years, we will not find financing. What happens when a government that cannot print money doesn't get finance options? You have to lose the currency system that we have, and you have to go printing money. We don't want that. That would be a catastrophe for Ecuador. We're acting responsible today. That's all that we have to do. We know that right decisions might not be popular, but that's what we're here for. We're here to do the right thing.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the interview.